Hello, design thinkers. Hello. So thank you so much for spending this time with me before lunch. Thank you so much. I'm long-winded, but I'm gonna try to get through this in 40 minutes. I think I can do it. I think I can. So welcome to Infographics for Social Change. Oop. There we go. Oop. Yeah, my name is Jessica Bellamy. I make information graphics, and just like she said, I have a small design agency called GRIDS, the Grassroots Information Design Studio. It is a small design agency in Louisville, Kentucky, a little bit south from here, and it only services nonprofits and community groups making information graphics. Another part of me is I'm also an alumni of the Adobe Creative Residency Program. It gave me the opportunity to start exploring some of these principles, to start writing them down so I can start sharing them out to folks about what grassroots information design looks like. And so yeah, I'm just gonna pretty much just jump into it. I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of different places, and so I really appreciate to get feedback and hang out with folks anytime later today. I'm definitely a very informal speaker, if you can't tell. So feel free, I'd love to continue conversations even after this. So, giving you some context. So I do have a design background. I graduated with 3 degrees from the University of Louisville. I graduated with graphic design, Pan-African studies, drawing, and I had a minor in communication. I did a little too much. And so that is a part of who I am to contextualize this talk. But I'm also a scholar. I graduated summa cum laude. I wrote a thesis that compared different design and the institution of art to talk about what are the best ways to start having some of these critical conversations, especially around race. I'm also a researcher. I worked in the neurodevelopmental science lab at the University of Louisville for almost 5 years of my life working with data. I'm also a community organizer. That's me there. I work in communities in Louisville, Kentucky. I go to lots of different meetings, lots of different community meetings, and I also share out different ways to elevate the work that folks are already doing. So yeah, I have a lot of different components to my personality, which informs why I created GRIDS, because information design is a really broad spectrum, and in many ways it's still being carved out. So just to kind of give you just a little bit of context as I move forward, yeah, I do different things like this, which is a presentation thing. It's like about this size in real life. Then, of course, I do accountability reports. I make materials for community organizers. Sometimes I've even been called upon to make medical illustrations for products that serve underrepresented folks. And of course, just like was mentioned, I'm a motion infographic designer. I use this in a lot of different ways, and so if you follow me on Instagram, you don't have to, but if you did, then you'd see some of the little fun vignettes that I make outside of just the client projects. And because of my diverse background with community organizing and research, I was actually called this more times than I've called it myself, experienced designer, which just means I work a lot from the community issue with people, moving it forward, and not all my solutions actually have design solutions. Sometimes it's literally just creating an initiative, some type of intervention for that community. So just kind of give you a little scope of who I am and how I've started to structure this idea of information design. It kind of helps you feed into some of these principles I'm going to share. A little bit more context in case you're not familiar with America. Right now we got an interesting president. And because of a lot of the initiatives that are getting pushed forward, because of the rise of conservatism and how a lot of our House and Senate has a lot of very conservative values, there's kind of a war on information going down, and it's a strong fight to keep people informed, right? So we have lots of different initiatives that you can see online, like how many people have seen this hashtag, Save the Data? Has anybody seen this? So yeah, I got a couple of hands in the room. Yeah, about in January 2017 is when I first saw this hashtag, because funny thing is, so we have a lot of different laws that have to do with data collection, a lot of data collection that our government sponsors, stuff that has to do with housing and affordability, so that grants can be put in areas to make sure that we're not discriminating against specific populations. One such area is, like I said, we had an act that was called the Local Zoning and Property Rights Protection Act that was from the Obama administration, and of course then we had some lovely Republican senators, not the Republican Party is terrible, but very conservative folks that decided, well, we're going to actually change this and make it to where we are no longer collecting data that involves looking at what racial disparities there are in the country. And one specific section of the bill that they created that was passed specifically said no federal funds may be used to design, build, maintain, utilize, or provide access to a federal database of geospatial information on community racial disparities or disparities in access to affordable housing. Isn't that kind of scary? Like, it wasn't that hard to pass. Then they went out for a lot of the data that was being collected around our environment and how it's changing. And so coalitions have been formed that are actually comprised of institutions both in America and even in Canada that are trying to save the data as it exists today, because a lot of our data that's used to fund a lot of our projects and initiatives to help us combat climate change and make sure everyone gets a fair share of housing. All that data is going to be gone soon. So there's a lot of different organizations that are trying to save what exists because they're not even going to keep it on their servers for much longer. Another thing that we're fighting is the idea of fake news. Who's heard of this term? Everybody. And it's a really interesting time to talk about information design. I've had the opportunity to do an interview with Communication Arts this year, and they definitely wanted me to start talking about what is the political applications of the time we're living in for information design. And I said, well, thank you for creating the space to happen. And absolutely, yeah, fake news has created an atmosphere where we need to be more direct with how we create our messages and making sure that we're transparent in where we get our data sources. Right now, it's important to make sure that the data is not being misunderstood or underrepresented. We also have one more thing that's going on in America. Yeah, we have some banned words from our CDC, which is one of our largest databases in our country. And so technically they're not banned words. They're really just words that are suggested to avoid if you want funding from the government. And those words are like diversity, vulnerable, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, science-based, and entitlement. You can't, if you want to be funded by our government right now and you are a data collecting institution, it's recommended that you don't use anything in this list if you're writing a report or a proposal. Just letting you know, there's a lot of scientists that are working to fight this, but we're in a very interesting time, and so that's why I really push the idea of infographics for social change, because we have a lot of misrepresentation of data, a lot of underrepresentation of data, and when you have these two things working together, you have these three pain points that happen. You have a lot of exacerbation of stereotypes, you have a lot of proliferated systemic issues that work against disenfranchised and vulnerable populations, and you get more objectification and exploitation, which is not intentional. I know so many people that are purpose-driven designers that because they don't have the mechanisms and measures to help keep their work equitable, they might happen that they objectify people in the work that they're doing, which is not the intent, but you know, the road to hell is paved in good intentions. We all know that quote. All right, moving forward. So whether or not you identify as a purpose-driven designer, as an information designer, or an experienced designer, I'm hoping that this presentation helps to not only look at your aspirations and not just make them better, not just make them good, but just make them braver. I'm hoping that this creates a space of challenge, discomfort, and inevitably transformation for your own work. So I always want the work I do to be, valuable. As I go forward, I also want to talk about equity. How many people have heard of the term equity in a social justice sense? See some hands in the room. It's okay if your hand's not up, because guess what? I'm going to tell you about it. So a lot of times when you see the word equity, some people think about equality, right? But equality has an operating assumption that everybody's created equal, right? That all you need is like one simple thing and everybody can get to the same goal. But that's not true. We have people coming at things with different weaknesses, different strengths, and because of that, we have to rethink how we think about designing materials and how we interact with people in our world. So I'm going to tell you a story of these three children who just love baseball. Oh my gosh, they love it. It's their favorite game. But of course, they're children, they don't have money, child labor laws as they are. There's this fence they can't see. They can't see the game they really would love to. So you have one kid who's on the far right who's already tall enough to see over the fence, right? He can see the front field, he can see what's going on, but the other kids cannot. So what can we do? If we find a resource and give it to all three kids, of course that'll work. That's the equality approach. Well, it doesn't work for everybody. So you'll have two kids that can stand and use the resource, but the other kid, the third kid, cannot. And even now, like the first kid who could already see the game, now he's like way up there. He can see the front field, the back field. He can see the snack stand. He really wants Cheetos. He's getting hungry. And the second kid, like she can see better, but maybe she can't see the backfield as well. She has to stand on her tippy toes a bit. And the third kid who can't see at all. So when we're talking about equitable solutions, it's taking our resources and maybe just changing them a bit. And we take like the first box, stack it on the second box, or we refashion the third box to be something more of a better fit for that third population. And of course, we're all able to see the game. I mean, of course, in a perfect world, there'd be no barriers to participation. But of course, that's dreaming forward. Anyways, we're going to get there. So equity is all about creating an opportunity for all to reach their full potential. And how do you do that? Well, I'll tell you. It's about being considerate, like looking at all of the different things, mechanisms happening, analyzing and evaluating recursively. And it's about being cooperative. It's getting involved with everyone else in the project as equal participants. Everyone is a subject matter expert. It's about being inclusive. Who's not at the table? Who else needs to be a part of this conversation? It's about being accountable. It's about being willing to take responsibility if something doesn't work. I'm not saying it was a bad idea to give everybody the same box, but I'm saying why can't we take responsibility for that not working to fix it, right? And it's about being flexible. It's actually having the willingness to fix it, to change a project to make sure it reaches everybody. And I'd like to take it a little step further. How many people have heard of Natasha Iskander? See a hand over there? She wrote a really interesting article called Design Thinking is Fundamentally Conservative and Preserves the Status Quo. Ooh, isn't that an interesting title? But it really breaks down like some of these ideas of design thinking as not really necessarily pushing us forward. But she likes to talk about how we need to create a better balance to create transformative work. Because we, as designers, yes, we're using empathy. And I don't know how many people were just in Margaret Cotton's session just a minute ago. She was talking about how, I should have added her in the slides because it's like, oh, she's fitting right into this Natasha Iskander thing. But that empathy is not just a step in the process, that it's an overwhelming push that drives the process. Does that make sense? Cool. Add Margaret in there. Okay. So back to information graphics. So we all know what information graphics are. Essentially, it's where you take data, whether it's quantitative, which is your numbers and your statistics, or if it's qualitative, which is your impact statements, your non-physical systems, intangible concepts, all that stuff. Well, you take that data, you add graphics, or illustrations, visual metaphors, and you get infographics. So essentially, infographics are just visual storytelling. Some of the things that I do are a lot of one-page explainers for community organizing. This is something I did for the American Heart Association earlier this year. But information graphics are not always the same as data visualizations. I like to say this because there's always someone who's like, I'm a data visualizer, and I never saw a connection, but now I do. So the difference is that data visualizations generally are meant to be more objective. They're using massive data sets and trying to show connections and correlations. So you see things like this, but with information graphics, you're really trying to create a visual narrative, so you get more pieces like this. Okay. So now I've contextualized everything. Stay strong. We're almost through. So back to grid. So what I do is what I call Grassroots Information Design. And what is that? Well, I'm going to tell you the 8 characteristics of this work. The first thing is that what I do is distribute it at the community level. So like I told you, I do a lot of one-page explainers to start breaking down policies, to break down services, things that go directly into the most affected population's hands to use as their own tools. And just like I said, it's going into the hands of the most affected population because it's all about access to that information. So when I started Grids, it was all because of a neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky called Smoketown. Smoketown is the oldest historically black neighborhood in our city. It was the only place that African Americans were allowed to live after the Civil War. I'm actually from Smoketown. This is my grandma. This is my mom. And because there were a lot of changes happening in our city concerning development and so forth and so on, Smoketown being right next to the downtown area, they found these developers found a great opportunity to start expanding the urban core because of a change in policy that got rid of the public housing I don't have to explain the ins and outs, because sometimes people are like, that's a lot of information. It's true. But anyways, essentially what happened, there was a public housing structure in Smoketown, and it was taken down to build mixed income houses. And when that happened, there were people that wanted to expand the urban core, since there's a big interest from the suburbs and millennials, all this, to move closer to downtown and have walkable whatnots, and these buildings have such character sort of situation. Gentrification started happening. How many people are familiar with gentrification, or that term at least? Okay, a lot of people. But that's essentially what gentrification is. It's about redesigning a neighborhood or a place for people that don't live there yet. It does not look at the residents. So something interesting happened. So there's an organization called Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, which I'm a part of. You saw a picture of me wearing that green shirt earlier. And we decided to go into the neighborhood, because when we were seeing these developers come in and they were using all their money to buy up so many parcels of land, we realized that no one was asking current residents what they would like to see, what their priorities and concerns were, what are assets that could use more funding. Like, if we're gonna have all this money come in, why can't everybody just live together, was essentially our idea. So we went door to door with a 55-question survey, sitting on porches, and ended up creating this report. Well, the funny thing is, when we released the report, it was widely successful. But our target audience originally was the policymakers and the developers that were coming into the area, so this information could be shared with them. But what actually happened was, yes, the developers said, thank you for the report, and put it on their shelves, but the residents themselves were going to these community meetings and community forums literally armed with weapons. So whenever like a council member said, oh, we can't do this, something like people would ask, why don't we have more public trash cans? Other neighborhoods have public trash cans. They would have some innocuous answer that doesn't even make sense. Well, we don't know about the levels of trash or litter in your neighborhood. And it's like, well, let me tell you. And so they were armed with a report where they could back up every claim they had. Once they had that data, you should have seen all the news stories that were happening that were really like smacking policymakers in the face. I won't mention anybody's name. But yeah, that's what happened. So that's why I created grids. I created grids about 4 years ago. It's still alive today and growing. So anyways, the next thing about grassroots information design is that there's a big part of barrier mapping in the work that I do. And when I say barrier mapping, it's looking at, when you think about your target audience, what are keeping them from that information, or what could keep them from what you're sharing out. So a lot of common barriers, of course, are like technology, and that means both access to computer or smartphone, access to internet, language, and that's not just the spoken language, but also the vernacular that's being used. If I work for a client that is breaking down a service, you don't want it to have too much jargon that is industry specific. You want it to be understandable. Literacy, and literacy not just in the way of how we traditionally think of it, the ability to read, but also reading a chart requires a certain type of literacy. I mean, we studied some of this in school. If you think back to your math classes, teaching you to read charts and graphs was a part of that. That's also part of literacy. The biggest barrier that I map with a lot of intention is actually the one that I think a lot of other designers don't think about as much, and that's time. When it comes to the population that you're sending something out to, you have to think about how much free time do they actually have. If I'm making a explainer about a service that a single mother of 2 who works is going to be the main target audience for, then I need to make sure that it's not something that if she looks at it, she's like, I'll read this later. It should not be wordy. It should not be paragraph upon paragraph of just too much, because her time is limited. Time is a resource, and everybody's time is different. The next component of grassroots information design is that it's always multi-pronged. So what I mean by that is I like to not just do the one-page explainer. Is there a meeting that's attached to this? Is there something that has to do sometimes with online? Not as much online depending on the population, but yeah, try different ways of accessing, because it actually widens your ability to get that data out further. I'm also always accountable to power dynamics in design. Just to note a few of them, the first one is the difference between working with and working for. When I put this on the screen, I feel like some people get what I'm saying. I'm not sure, but what I mean is the difference between working with community and working for community creates If you're thinking of 4, it creates a hierarchy. If you're thinking of width, it's collaboration. We oftentimes lose sight of the fact that when we're designers and we're giving our skills, we feel like we're donating something to like a population that doesn't have power. That's why I also don't like using the term empowering, because everybody's got power. You can embolden, you can show people the more things about the power that they have, but it's literally more about that collaboration and coming from a grounded place where everybody gets dignity and everyone has the ability to change and affect the project. I also think about credibility and authority. Cleanly designed things give a lot of credibility and authority. If you have 2 nonprofits, both of them doing the same service, like let's say they're working around affordable housing issues, the nonprofit that has the really well-designed logo versus the nonprofit whose logo was made by Kelly and Accounting's, brother Larry back in '04, like that logo, like let's say it's not as good as this clean one over here. This nicer designed, more contemporary, modern logo type is more likely to get funding, because the foundation that's giving the money will assume that they'll have more longevity, that the quality of their work must be deeper. They already must have funders if they have this nice design, so then they're more likely to get the funding, even though we don't really know much about the work of either. Does that make sense? Cool. I also think about the fact that information graphics are not exhaustive. When I say exhaustive, I mean a lot of times people see, again, the sort of clean designed infographic, and the data is actually not good data. Or it's from an institution that doesn't exist. We're in a time where a president will send out infographics from institutions that don't exist. It's already happened. To save time, I won't tell you the story, but you can ask me about it later. We'll have a little chuckle. All right. The next thing I think about is the fact that design in general defines narratives. And I like to put up here branding as a tool for colonization, because it's true. For folks that may be more familiar with gentrification than others, you can completely erase the culture and history of a neighborhood by changing the branding. One of the developers that came into Smoketown tried to rebrand it as the Creative Innovation Zone to attract different artists and creative types. What's wrong with Smoketown? It's it's created after the Civil War. It's already got history. It's already got culture. It's already got people there. So you hear what I'm saying? I'm going to keep going. All right. I also think about the fact that the design industry is exclusive and expensive. We actually talked about this in the mentoring table this morning, the fact that how much a software costs, all these things are different barriers to participation. It limits who can become a content creator. And when you start doing that, when you start limiting who can become a content creator, you get a lot of bad content. Look at this one from Nivea, where it says, re-civilize yourself. And then you see it's like a black man, and he's holding like an afro-headed thing. He's going to throw away this afro head because it's uncivilized. That's the idea we get. And from earlier this year, what we saw from H&M, coolest monkey in the jungle. Y'all didn't see this? Yeah, this was earlier this year. I'm just saying. That's what happens when you limit who's allowed to be a content creator. We can talk more about it too, again. Like, I'm just trying to fly through. Okay, the next thing I think about is the problematic nature of aesthetics over function. I've worked on a project that was a redesign of something that was cleanly designed, but because it used so it was about the serious nature of healthcare in our state being taken away. So there was a lot of things involving people's plans that were going to change. And there was a coalition of healthcare organizations that had a flyer that said, if you're a single mom, this is what's going to happen. If you're a student, this is what's going to happen. If you get insurance through this is what's going to happen, to show the change. But when people saw the flyer, they were like, oh, this is cool, thanks. But they didn't think about it, and when it happened, it was crazy. And the only reason why they didn't think of it as a bad thing or that they should investigate this flyer is because it was in rainbow pastel colors, and it looked really cheerful and bright. So it said healthcare, and they're like, yeah, cheerful and bright, good, my future looks great. And so then when it happened, they were like, why didn't you tell us? You're a coalition. Well, the coalition was trying to make these meetings happen, and so many people were mad statewide. But there was a flyer that was sent out. It just, the aesthetics, the problematic nature of aesthetics over function. It wasn't doing what it needed to do. It was beautiful, but it wasn't doing what it needed to do. Moving forward. So the sixth characteristic of grassroots information design is that it's advocacy facing. So when I make explainers and things of that nature, I make sure that whatever I talk about is not just sharing the data points with no point of action. The goal is to move people to action. So this is an example of a project that I worked on at the beginning of this year. Well, it was released at the beginning of this year. We worked on it last year, called The People's Guide to the Budget, where myself and some other community organizers worked to break down our 300 and some odd page Louisville budget so that people could know where their money was going. But in our first draft that we shared out to other members of Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, people were like, oh, this is cute, great, go ahead. And we're like, but you're supposed to be driven to action. We revisited the drawing board, and we realized we weren't telling people specifically what we would like them to do or what they could do. And we weren't using language that was more assertive. For example, we started talking about how the fact that this is their money, right? If you're a resident of Louisville, this is your money, you've contributed to this, and if you don't feel like it affects your priorities and concerns, here's specifically what you can do right now. So that's how we changed the report. And we got a lot more interest and even some news coverage from it. And we actually got a little, some policy change involved. You can ask me about it later if you want to know. Next one. The seventh thing that is a characteristic of the work I do is it's measured by equity. So I gave you that list earlier of the 5 things that make up equity. These are the measures that I look at every time I do projects. I also use these 6 principles of conscious and responsible design. The first one being authentic representation. How many people have heard of Margaret Cho? A lot of hands in the room. So Margaret Cho is a Korean-American comedian. She actually used to have a TV show back in the early 2000s that was called All American Girl. And in All American Girl, well, not in the show, but ABC, who put the show on, they asked her, hey, do you mind doing a little guest spot on a little mini commercial between breaks, just, for the holidays? She goes, oh, sure, I'll come in the studio. She comes into the studio, she's sitting in this chair, and they were like, okay, so we want you to say, happy holidays from ABC, but in your native language. And so like they went rolling, and she goes, happy holidays from ABC. And they were so mad. They were so mad. They wanted her to speak Korean. But that's not fair. That's not fair. If she doesn't feel like that's an authentic representation of herself, that's not something you can ask someone to do. So that's another way, like when we were talking about the objectification and exploiting that we can do with good intentions, would have bad results. Yeah, that was an example of that. The next conscious and responsible principle is mindful and sensitive portraiture. I worked on a web infographic that had to do with how incarceration affects families in Kentucky. And not that these slides particularly pertain to the data point that I use, well, the data point I'm about to talk about, but just to show you like some images from that web infographic. But one thing that I found was there was a data point. So, okay, let me start here actually. So the review body for this infographic was a series of people. I had people that were part of organizations that worked with youth whose parents were formerly incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. I worked with parents who had been formerly incarcerated. I worked with adults whose parents are either formerly or currently. So the body was like wide. Whether or not you worked with institutionally, worked with incarceration institutionally, or if you were personally affected, you were part of this group of reviewing board that I had for this project. And one thing that happened was a lot of the nonprofits that use certain data points to get funding every year, they were like, hey, could you use this data point in the infographic? We would really love it. It will reinforce that data point, please. And so like I would look at the data, check to make sure if it was authentic, whatnot. And one data point that was given to me that was from a reputable source, it was a credible source, and the measure and indicators were like, you can understand how they could get this conclusion. The data point had to do with the likelihood of a child whose parent is currently incarcerated or has been formerly incarcerated. What's the likelihood of that child to commit a crime themselves? This institution works with youth who are affected by incarceration every day, and that is a data point they used to get funding. But when I put that in one of the drafts for this web infographic, the first thing that happened were parents immediately wrote back to me and was like, how dare you? Stop criminalizing my child. This data point is offensive. You're making it sound like my kid is going to enter this world and be a problem to everyone around them. And I was like, oh no, that's not my intention. So it actually ended up being a very mediated conversation between that organization and one of the parents in particular, because most of the parents, when they saw that data point, it made them not even want to do the project anymore. They still stayed on because I took the data point out. Because the whole point of this infographic was to really affect this issue for the population most affected. So I took that data point out. The organization was upset about me taking it out, but I told them, like, this is why I do work the way I do, because it's not meant to be, it's literally meant to be equity-centered. So it's more than just being human-centered. It's more than just like how people use it and having the stories of these individuals. It is actually applying it in a way that is considerate, inclusive. You get it. I was talking about equity measures. Yeah. So moving forward, because I'm running out of time. The next one is narrating data points. That's something that I do often. In that same infographic, there was a data point that I had that had to do with how expensive it was for our state to continue incarcerating at the rate that it was. And I was worried about, if I put that data point in there with the little amount of space that I have, if I don't have time to talk about restorative justice measures versus what I thought was going to be the negative connotation. It was all based, my whole quandary was based on a term called selective perception. How many people have heard of selective perception? Got some hands in the room. How many people have heard of All in the Family? Got some more hands in the room. How many people have heard of Family Guy? Okay, more hands. Okay, good. So essentially, Family Guy it's modeled after All in the Family. So All in the Family was a TV show that was created by these two guys who wanted to create this person that was bigoted, sexist, homophobic, you name it. If it's an ism, he got it. But it's a person you don't want to be, like someone who's like just dumb and slovenly, and you're not supposed to want to be Archie Bunker, right? Which is, your Peter Griffin of Family Guy. But the funny thing is that when the show went out, not everybody got the metaphor, but it was widely popular. So part of the audience completely got that it was satire and was like, yeah, this dude is crazy and wild. He's terrible. And they watched it. And there was another group that was like, he thinks exactly how I think. And they watched it. So there were two very different ideas happening from one TV show, and it was widely popular. And that whole situation is selective perception. That's the problem. That's the mechanism going on there. And so when I realized I didn't have enough space to really talk about that data point, either people were going to be like, yeah, it's really expensive. We should find other methods to deal with problems involving people committing crimes or whatnot, something to do with restorative justice, or people could think, look how expensive these criminals are making it in our state. Look what they're doing to our tax dollars, and continue that negative rhetoric in their minds. So yeah, narrate your data points. And if you don't have time, you just take it out. I had to take that data point out because there's actually a ratio of how long a web infographic can be before people stop reading. So I was trying to stay within that ratio. Next one is disaggregation of data. So how many people have heard of this term, disaggregation of data? Oh, no, in the room? Oh, yeah, it's right there. Yeah, one person in front. Okay, so disaggregation of data is it's relatively new. I heard about it in 2015 at a conference at the Equity Summit in LA, and essentially it means if you're trying to tell a story about a population and they don't see themselves in that data, then you need to get new data. And so the most common use that is negative that involves disaggregation of data is the fact that in America, when we have a data set that is tied to demographics, we tend to lump Asians in one data point. But the experience of someone from the Philippines versus someone from Japan, like their experience in America, it's going to be different because they're within the lens of America, right? So like color and all that, all those involvements and where people usually start, you may not tell an accurate story. So there's different coalitions that work with data collecting agencies, because there's like this whole initiative to start disaggregating some of these Asian data points. If you want to know more about that, I can tell you even some like really interesting stories from this year, because it's also inspired some policy change even in New York. Ask me later. Okay, and the next one is that I use recursive feedback cycles when I'm designing. And all that means is that I'm constantly talking to people from ideation all the way to the final product. Like that one project about incarceration, it took a lot of time, but just like Margaret Cotton said earlier today, is that you have to put a lot of rigor in work like this. You have to put a lot of effort. It's going to take longer than a traditional design project, but literally constantly being in conversation. And I do my utmost best to make sure that the work that I do is led by the most affected population. The main reason why I do that is because they truly understand the problem. So they'll understand the root causes, they'll understand what are realistic solutions. They already have the network to the community that you might be trying to reach or work with, so forth and so on. So it's really an invaluable thing to build into your work if you can. Well, if you can, put in that rigor. This is the challenge. And then you have to move that to discomfort and then to transformation. Sorry, brave aspirations, just bringing it back there. And then, of course, again with the Natasha Iskander, she's always coming back, is that she says specifically, we are limited by what we view is significant and the relationships that we can imagine. Whether you're a designer, whether or not you're creative or just a planner, like everyone in this room, we are literally limited in how we can perceive the world. And that's okay. That's why we have to have more collaborations between people and more intentional collaborations, rather, with more people. I also follow the design justice principles that are set by the Design Justice organization. They're located in Detroit. They do a conference every year. I recommend going if you want to go. It's in June. It's very fun. So they have a whole network principle list that is really great if you want to refer to that. A lot of what they talk about in their principles are also in this presentation in different ways, because I found them last year, and I realized how much we connected. So I joined the Design Justice Network, and if you join the network, then you get to be a part of these great emails, and I know, great emails, what does that mean? But, but these great emails of conversation involving how can we make the work better. Yeah. Another big principle even that they also share is skill sharing. So I've been trying to do a lot of teaching about a lot of these conscious and responsible principles of design, how to build equity, both data equity and data transparency into the work that you're doing. So like I have a workshop later today, if folks want to come, where we're going to actively do some stuff. I call it the Graphic Ally Hackathon. But there's lots of other different things that I teach on too, which I won't get into because, again, sake of time. I'm just going to show you some more photos. And because of all this work that I've been doing over the last year and a half, like where I've been going to different conferences and to different universities doing workshops, I've actually created this tool called the Infographic Wheel. No, I did not bring any with me. I'm just going to say that now. But essentially, it's a handheld tool that helps you pick a infographic layout based on the characteristics of your data. Because one thing I realized in doing these workshops is that we have a limited library in our minds of infographics that we can imagine, like infographic solutions, visualization solutions. So I created this tool, and I'm actually expanding upon it in 2019. So, look to it in the future. So I also started doing a lot more visual storytelling on my own in the last year, especially because I had the time being an Adobe Creative Resident where I could pursue new things like motion graphics, and representation has always been a big part of my work. But once I started incorporating motion graphics, I started having really interesting projects that had to do with design. I'm just going to kind of flip forward because I did this collaborative project that had to do with the dynamic structural model of racism, this right here. And I was working with a student who had just sent me some things, and I wasn't supposed to redesign that model. It was a mistake, but our curiosity led into a visual conversation, and some experimentation happened, and bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, like all sorts of things. And I was playing with different vignettes that I thought were really fun and playful to try to get more people to have dialogue about race on social media. And funny thing was, because it's so bright and colorful, people thought it was something. They didn't think it was about race, even though it says race in the middle. And so I actually got invited to continue doing this work in a lot of different ways. Like I was invited to do live work at the Logitech booth at Max last year, and they wanted me to specifically work on this project. And I think because it was really colorful, and so when they mic'd me and I did live work like for 3 sessions, it was really interesting because people would come up and be like, oh, "This is really beautiful," and they'd be like, "What is this?" "Well, it's the dynamic structural model of racism," and they'd be like, "Oh, I've stepped into it." "Yes, you have. Welcome. Come on, let's hug." So that's a fun thing. I also started doing a couple of different web motion graphic series, like A Few Ideas, which was meant to help people replicate successful social change projects. And I went through a lot of ideation and iterations involving that, and ended up inevitably creating what I call Bubble, which is a living, breathing infographic that can be triggered on your computer. I was talking earlier today with someone about Character Animator, who's used Character Animator. I don't know if you've used it before? Cool. That's what I use to make Bubble. So yeah, it's probably one of the few non-anthropomorphized puppets that I've ever seen. Like it's not a human. It's not meant to be a human, but literally you can push buttons on your keyboard and film live sessions, and so it's like a teaching tool. And so I did that last year. Yeah. And I also started designing from the margins, which was just me having fun, but also because of my creative unrest about racial injustice. So, I kept it playful to get people in again. Always got to do it that way. But I create a lot of different vignettes that are pretty cool. You saw this one earlier. I'll go to some of this. Like I talk about ethnomathematics. Here's another example, because I don't know if you knew, but every braid is actually a math equation, and it's actually built into some African cultures, and like knowingly built, like into the way they do architecture, the way that they do divination practices, so forth and so on. It's really interesting. So, and I also started talking about what the Black aesthetic is, which is a very larger term. I don't want to keep you all for too long, so I'm like, run, go through it, get through the content. So, but yeah, you can go online, you can see some of these, and some of these are on YouTube. But this was something I did just for myself. So if I don't update, things, like if you go to my YouTube and you're like, there's not much here, it's because, it's doing it of my own volition. But yeah, thank you so much. I hope that this was valuable. Feel free to talk to me later about anything that you've seen today.